permission from King Edgar, he lost no time in expelling from the monastery such detestable blasphemers against God. He replaced them there with monks from Abingdon, to whom he was thus both abbot and bishop. That's a fun text, because nothing Ethelwald does is ever at any setting on the dial but 11, right? It's got to be exciting. So this expulsion of the secular canons are priests, not monks, who live in a community. From the Cathedral of Winchester, a building called the Old Minster, to separate it from the other big church in Winchester, which was known as the New Minster, very cleverly. This expulsion of the secular canons excited debate then, and it still does today, as did its perpetrator, Ethelwald. And we're very lucky, actually, to have a picture of Ethelwald from around his own lifetime. There is Ethelwald from an illustration which occurs actually no less than 3 times in medieval manuscripts from the era and from about 100 years afterwards. There's Ethelwald on the left, King Edgar in the center, and Dunstan on the right with a very acrobatic monk holding the text underneath them. Ethelwald is a very controversial figure. He was controversial then, he is controversial today. Modern historians take this moment when he expelled these priests, these secular canons, as the beginning of what we know today as the monastic or Benedictine reform movement in England in the 10th century. And this was a period of immense cultural flowering in terms of the creations of texts, art, and architecture. And you're going to see some of these artistic creations because Ethelwald was at the center of all of it. Many then and since have seen this as the peak of the early medieval Kingdom of England, which had only been unified for a very short time when all of this was going on. Only really for about 2 or 3 generations had England come together by this point. But this is also an era long before the kind of medieval England that you may be more familiar with. It's certainly before the Norman conquest that happened at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and therefore it's before things like the Black Death, the Crusades, before chivalry and romance, and before knights in shining armor. This was an era when the conversion to Christianity was still something that was relatively new and even ongoing in parts of Europe. When Charlemagne's dream of a return to Roman Empire was not yet wholly dead, and when the Vikings still plundered the seas. Indeed, they had briefly conquered most of England in living memory in Ethelwald's day. This was the era of Old English, before French collided with our language, and of the poetry of Beowulf. And Ethelwald stood at the heart of it all, and is seen by most scholars today as not only the primary mover of the monastic reform movement, but as its strictest, most uncompromising, some have said ruthless and fanatical proponent. My research is a biography on this fascinating, complex, and I argue misunderstood figure. Why misunderstood? I'm not suggesting that Ethelwald was deep down a nice guy and has just been maligned. He was absolutely zealous and ruthless, and you should never get into a property dispute with him because he will wreck you and take all your land. He was extreme, he was a political manipulator of the highest order, and he made many, many enemies. But Ethelwald was also a brilliant intellectual, a patron of the arts, and most importantly, he was a man with a vision. Most scholars today would argue that that vision was entirely limited to reforming and promoting a limited group of Christians, the monks. But I argue that his view of monasticism is far different from the one that we have today, what we would expect. It instead encompassed all ordinary English Christians, the laity as well. Indeed, the whole English church fell within his view of what monastic reform should look like. So in a nutshell, Ethelwald has been understood as jumping on the then relatively new trend of strictly secluding or cloistering monks away from secular society, the idea that they would go live and never come out, or at least as rarely as possible come out and interact with non-monks. That was something that was only really beginning to become the norm for monks in the 10th century. I argue that instead Ethelwald idealized and misunderstood the past. Instead, he imagined that the clergy of the church had been entirely monastic when England had first converted to Christianity. And so he intended his Reformed monks to provide pastoral care to the laity, as those early missionary monks had done, rather than to be fully secluded away in their cloisters, as was becoming commonplace elsewhere in Europe. And this exemplifies two further points that we should always consider about history more broadly. The people that we remember as visionaries, the people we think of as having shaped history, often did not envision the world that we know came into being. Nor did the reformers who looked to the past understand it the way that historians do today. So my argument is not something that's easy to prove, despite the comparative wealth of evidence. And I am an early medievalist, which means a wealth of evidence to me is like several dozen documents. Not like your American history professors that have, just thousands of newspapers and diaries and all kinds of other things to work with. A couple of dozen documents is a massive wealth in this time period. And Ethelwald and his circle of followers and students did produce dozens of documents. And it's really a treasure trove by the standards of the era. We're also very lucky in that his diocese of Winchester, the city of Winchester, has been the subject since the 1960s of one of the earliest and most involved urban archaeology programs that has ever been done in the modern world. But that's still only a view through a cracked lens. And medievalists have to deal with this all the time. We have to painfully work with incomplete and spotty evidence, reading against the grain, not only because of biases, intentional or otherwise, but to simply wring every last drop of potential evidence from every scrap of information. And I'm going to give you one of the most frustrating examples of that I have ever come across by the end of this presentation. Even so, I can only include a few of my favorite examples here and show you how they have to be read very carefully, but I'm happy to answer questions and include more after the talk is done. All right, so I'm arguing that Ethelwald imagined and sought to create an English church which entirely was composed of monks. Not that the lay people would be monks, but that every single member of the clergy, every single priest, would also be a monk. And that was the reasoning was that he wanted to maintain rigorous ascetic standards of living while also providing pastoral care to the laity. And this is a problem generally recognized around the year 1000 across Christendom. This is an era in which, for instance, clerical celibacy was just not taken for granted. Many priests were married in this era. If you wanted to increase the standard of priests, how were you going to go about doing it? Ethelwald's rather unique solution was make all the priests monks. Make them all monks. This is a very controversial opinion, though, in my specialty, and for good reason. Ethelwald is seen as a reformer, a term which we apply very broadly to a host of different religious movements over time. Of course, originally it was only used to describe the famous and much later Protestant Reformation. And the problem is that means we often expect such reforming figures to both anticipate the developments that we know in hindsight are going to happen to the church, and that they will understand their past the way that we do today. And I'm arguing that Ethelwald did neither. He neither actually saw the church that was going to come into being, nor did he really understand the past of the church the way that we understand it today. Ethelwald is often taken as being one step in a chain of events leading inexorably to the kind of later medieval church and even modern church that is more familiar to us. A world where monks are cloistered, and they live secluded away as far as possible from the laity, and pastoral care is instead provided by an individual local parish priest in an all-encompassing infrastructure that sees a little church in every village and neighborhood and Christendom. Such a world as I just described, however, only came into being in the 100 years or so after Ethelwald died. That is in the 11th century. That was a century in which, at the top, the papacy finally asserted its own power, both politically in wresting independence from the kings in the investiture controversy, and religiously with the rigorous application of standards to the clergy, such as enforcing clerical celibacy and monastic claustration. That's a movement we now call the Gregorian reforms, but that's all after Ethelwald. In that same century after Ethelwald's death in 988, a profusion of building across Western Europe resulted in what one contemporary described as the world, quote, cladding itself everywhere in the white mantle of churches. And this is often very hard for us to understand. We look at pictures of the European countryside and we imagine that these ancient villages must go back to the beginning of the Middle Ages. They do not. The first half of the Middle Ages, people generally lived on individual farms. They didn't live in nucleated little villages. And if you live in individual little farms, then where do you have the church? The little parish church can only be born once villages exist. And the process of what historians rather painstakingly call villagization really is only beginning to occur in Ethelwald's lifetime. It's easy to imagine then, given some of the priorities that we can see in the passage that I quoted at the start, and others that I will come to shortly, that Ethelwald was seen as prefiguring this more familiar image of the Christian church, of one that enforced strict clerical celibacy. But that was not the world that Ethelwald lived in, as I said, and more importantly, it was not the nostalgic image of the past that he looked back to. Certainly he had contemporaries, both in England and on the continent, who could be seen as part of a direct line towards those reforms of a century later, that is, the reforms of the Gregorian age and the investiture controversy, witnessed in such places as the famous reforming monastery of Cluny in 910, which was actually the largest church in Christendom for 500 years, as well as other reforming monasteries like Fleury in 930 or Ghent in 944. All of these monasteries would be places that Ethelwald was familiar with. But Ethelwald, as we shall see, instead had in his mind a long-lost golden age of the English church, separated from his own time by a quarter of a millennium, and including a century of Viking ages in between them. He saw this past, however, through an even more distorted lens than we do today, and his aims were not that of modern historians, but of a nostalgic fundamentalist. My goal then is not just to correct what I see as a teleological explanation for Ethelwald's action, and teleological means that it's an anachronistic one that imagines that since we know the ending, that must have been the goal from the beginning. It's a fancy way of saying a sort of circular argument. He wasn't striving for the future that we know came to be after him, but to imagine the past the way he did, to forget modern scholarship of the past, and instead imagine how Ethelwald imagined his past. Not as historians have painstakingly reconstructed through modern standards of academic scholarship, but as Ethelwald would have read. Okay. Oh, and to give you a sort of sense of this, Winchester is here in the circle area. Abingdon, the abbey that he had originally been the abbot of before he became bishop, is just to the north of it. And here are some of the monasteries that I mentioned being reformed on the continent. So they're relatively close by. But the simple, important point is that Ethelwald chose to replace his entire clerical staff of the Old Minster. We'll have a sequence here. There's the Old Minster, a modern imagining of what it would look like. He intended to replace the entire clerical staff of his Old Minster cathedral with monks. Now, this actually became relatively common because he did it. England is famous for a very unusual quality of its cathedrals, which is several medieval cathedrals were entirely staffed by monks. York Minster, for instance, ends up being staffed by monks. Canterbury ends up being staffed by monks. All of these places retained their monastic character down until Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries during the Reformation. But when Ethelwald did it, no one else had done it. He was the very first person to replace the entire clergy of this cathedral with monks. And none of his contemporaries did this. It was only a generation later, after they had all died, that the other English cathedrals started to follow suit, and not all of them ever did so. Instead, his fellow contemporary reformers always kept some secular, that is, pastorally focused clergy alongside their monks at the cathedrals. They might have some monks, but they would have non-monastic clergy there as well. Ethelwald doesn't do this. If you're not a monk, you're out. Get going. And that's pretty unusual because there was an alternative model that was becoming common on the continent. And it would have been relatively easy to do this. Keep the cathedral at the cathedral non-monks and have a monastery next door. And this would have been relatively easy because, in fact, there was another giant church right next to the Old Minster Cathedral called the New Minster. It would have been very easy to do what was going on the continent. make sure there were monks in the new minster and priests who could do pastoral care but were not monks at the old minster. Ethelwald says no. He kicks all of the existing priests out of both of these buildings and replaces all of them with monks. And that's a little weird, because Old Minster had to have an interaction with lay Christians, because it was a cathedral. The cathedral is by definition the seat of a bishop. That's where we get our word cathedral. It comes from the Latin cathedra, which means throne. You may have caught in the quotation I gave at the beginning, the site of the bishop's throne. That's very important. That's the see that the bishop directs his entire diocese from. You have to have lay people come into a cathedral. It is the chief church of the entire diocese. And so to staff it entirely with monks means that those monks are going to have to interact every single day, all the time, with lay Christians. They cannot be secluded away from the world if they are the staff of a cathedral. So this is unprecedented, and it's weird. And we can tell from our existing documents, from our few but very precious surviving documents, that Ethelwald did intend the monks at Old Minster to interact with lay Christians. And the best example of this is a saint's life that was produced at his direction by a monk that he had actually gotten from one of these other reforming monasteries on the continent, from Fleury. This was a monk by the name of Lanfred, who had come to live in England under Ethelwald's patronage. And Ethelwald said, I need a hagiography of a saint for Winchester. But Winchester didn't have any famous saints. It didn't have any martyrs. It hadn't had anybody do anything particularly saint-worthy. And so they invented a saint. Why do I say invented? Well, because the saint that they found, St. Swithin, the only thing they knew about him was that he had been a bishop of Winchester about 100 years earlier, and that he had the biggest, coolest tomb right outside the front door of the cathedral. Everybody had to pass by it on their way in, and during Ethelwald's lifetime, just after he had become bishop, people started reporting that they were experiencing miracles by this big, impressive tomb. But other than that the guy inside it had been the bishop and he was named Swithin, they didn't know any other details about his life. Even just 100 years later, we don't know any other details about Swithin's life even today. He may have been related to some locals in Winchester. That's the best theory, but other than that, we really don't know anything. So the author of this hagiography, this biography of a saint, can't make up a life. He can only tell the stories of the miracles for the pilgrims that are coming to Winchester. And this is relatively easy to just declare this guy a saint, because sainthood at this point is not determined by the papacy. Canonization is not controlled from Rome. Whoever the local bishop wants to hold up as a saint is a saint, as long as the local bishop is for it. And the term for this is that they have discovered a saint. And in Latin, the term to discover is invenire. And that's where we get our word invention. So the usual English translation, invention, doesn't usually mean made up, but in this case, they did make up Swithin. And that sounds a little bit cynical, but he was immensely popular almost immediately. If Lanford is to believe, and we have no reason to doubt this, thousands of pilgrims started descending on Winchester when they heard there was a new saint who was performing miracles there. They were all coming to the Old Minster to see this new saint. And relatively unusually for contemporary hagiography for saints' lives, Lanford largely describes ordinary lay Christians receiving these miracles, not the monks. In fact, the monks of Winchester don't receive any of these miracles. Only pilgrims receive the miracles. And they're not monks, they're not even usually members of the clergy. In fact, some of them appear to be normal poor people, not even kings or things along those lines. They're desperate to receive cures. They covered the pavement of the church. They filled the precinct round about it. Certainly there would have been spaces that the monks could retreat to sleep and eat, but every time the monks of Old Minster wanted to go perform the Mass, you have to imagine them stepping around sleeping pilgrims, if it's at night. That this was a place filled with lay people, not just the ordinary lay interactions you would expect of any church, but literally hundreds of pilgrims for years are flooding this space. So the laity is literally underfoot. It's everywhere. Filled with pilgrims day and night. They weren't expelled in the evening. And this is reported in a particularly delightful miracle, and I highly suggest reading. I know I'm a nerd about these kinds of things. The life of St. Swithin is delightful for many reasons, but one of my favorite incidents is a miracle that is reported. What happens? Well, apparently the monks decided they didn't like getting up in the middle of the night every single time a miracle occurred. Ethelwald had instructed them that anytime a miracle occurred, the monks were to drop whatever they were doing, go out into the church, and sing praises to God in front of the pilgrims. And we're told repeatedly by Lanfred that the lay people would join in and imitate this prayer. They would join in the praying. So the monks and the pilgrims would be praying together. And we're told that the monks didn't like doing this. Not because they disagreed with the idea of interacting with the laity at all, but because it was annoying to have to constantly get up and leave your studies or leave whatever you were doing, or get up in the middle of the night, as often happened, to go do this. And so this miracle that's reported is that a woman in town actually received a vision of Swithin who said, "Go tell the bishop they're not doing it." And Ethelwald apparently received this story of the vision, believed the noble woman, and told the monks, if you don't get up to go and do it, you are on penance with nothing but bread and water for a week. Like I said, I'm not saying Ethelwald wasn't strict. He was very strict. But in this case, he was strict about the monks going out and praying with the laity. Not to the laity, with the laity. And that's also worth sort of keeping in mind here. That we've got these groups coming together. This is a teachable moment, as we would put it in modern terms, for the monks and the laity to gather together. Hagiography, like this work by Lanfred, is a pretty formulaic genre, and many of my fellow medievalists dismiss it as boringly repetitive. However, this is an excellent example of why we need to always be careful with such assumptions. Hagiography is filled with tropes, with standard formulaic passages. For all the saints in the end are supposed to imitate the story, the life of the other saints, and ultimately Jesus Christ. But within these constraints, there are many themes that a hagiographer can choose to emphasize or de-emphasize. Here, Lanfred is emphasizing miracles, cures, and the praising of God. His other alternatives would be, for instance, smiting the heathen or the blasphemer. That was also very popular in the 10th century. Anytime someone does something the saint doesn't like, they smite them with things. But Swithin doesn't do that. So choosing to focus on this is a very deliberate choice on the part of Lanfred, and therefore on the part of Ethelwald, who's paying for Lanfred to sit down and write down all of this stuff. And paying somebody to write down all this stuff was a lot more expensive back then than it is today. So some consideration has to be given here to these enormous crowds of pilgrims coming in. And the fact that that's the focus of the life of St. Swithin. And I like to think of it, by the way, most of these illustrations are coming from a beautiful text that I don't really have a lot of time to talk about called The Benedictional of Ethelwald. This was his personal bishop's book that held all the special ceremonies that only a bishop could preside over. And it's one of the greatest and most beautiful examples of late 10th century Anglo-Saxon English art. Here, for instance, is the entry of Christ into Jerusalem being depicted in the Benedictional of Ethelwald. And I like to think that this is modeled on what Ethelwald would have imagined a pilgrim celebration to look like. Here's people coming in a big pageant, and look at all the people who are just hanging out, literally hanging from the trees in order to get a look at this religious celebration. And this is something that, while it's meant to depict an event happening, in the 1st century AD in Jerusalem, is of course being imagined by someone who's living in 10th century Winchester and probably has all of those pilgrims hanging around the old minster at Winchester in his mind as he makes this illustration. But Ethelwald goes further. He has a massive new building program, and here's where we come to this old minster, Winchester. The Old Minster, as the name implies, was already quite old. It had been originally built around 300 years earlier in the first era of conversion in the 600s. But by this point, that was considered to be quite small. And now we're going to vastly expand its size to the point that it's incredibly large, certainly much more space than was necessary for the monastic community of the Old Minster. In fact, more space than was necessary for everybody all the monks in the Old Minster, and all the monks in the New Minster, and all the nuns over in, you guessed it, Nunaminster was the third church. They really had a naming theme in Winchester. There would have been plenty of room for all of them, with room left over to spare for lay Christians. That meant that the Old Minster could serve its main function as the cathedral and thus the primary church in the city of Winchester. Winchester had grown enormously over the past 2 generations, and it functioned in many ways as the capital of the newly unified Kingdom of England. A royal palace, for instance, stood just across the street, or the square, from the Old and New Minsters, and the city walls probably incorporated a thriving population in the thousands. And that was really impressive in 10th century England. A population approaching 10,000 would have made Winchester probably the second biggest city in the British Isles after London. So this is a big population that needs a big church. Moreover, there really was no other alternative for pastoral care. Even though this was a pretty big town, and we know Winchester later in the Middle Ages had literally dozens of small neighborhood churches, few of them can be dated back to Ethelwald's lifetime. And those few that can be seen in the archaeological record as having existed this far back do not appear to have been parish churches. They were private chapels, or perhaps stational chapels that were only used in big liturgical celebrations that moved around the town. In other words, there was not yet a parish network to speak of in Winchester, just like there wasn't yet one in England generally. And legislation produced by King Edgar at the time, assuredly written with the input of Ethelwald, his mentor, gives us our first evidence for the ancient minster churches, as they came to be known in England, were beginning to claim priority over the very few new little churches that were just starting to pop up, like these private chapels. The Old Minster in particular, we know from later records in the Middle Ages, jealously kept its rights. All the way down to the Protestant Reformation, no one in Winchester could be baptized or buried anywhere else but at the Old Minster. And of course, those are absolutely central components of pastoral care. That even later parishes could not wrest away from the minster and its monastic staff. So Ethelwald was therefore thinking materially of the space for his monks and for lay petitioners on a scale never before attempted in English history, something essential if the former, the monks, were to be expected to provide pastoral care to the latter, the laity, at the Old Minster. And it really is an incredibly impressive structure, especially when you see what the original one looked like. That's the original floor plan that can be seen up there. There was an outlying tower. St. Swithin's grave is right in between them. That's the little circle with a question mark over it. It gets incorporated into a new, larger structure, and almost immediately Ethelwald decides, no, it's not big enough. Like someone who halfway through getting their house renovated is like, you know what? I think we're just going to keep going. Let's go big or go home. And he makes this massive structure, and the church at Winchester, although not particularly large by the standards of modern cathedrals, at the time was more than 250 feet long and probably the largest building in England, at least until it was surpassed by the Westminster Abbey about 100 years later. So this is a pretty impressive structure, and you can see it today. The archaeological excavations have been done. They're finished, but when they recovered it up, they left the outline that they had found in the archaeological work. And we're very lucky because, of course, the Normans, who are the worst, because the Normans who conquered England about a century after Ethelwald tore down every single Anglo-Saxon cathedral and rebuilt them in the newer Romanesque and later Gothic styles. But apparently the Normans decided to build just slightly off where the old one had been. So we were able to excavate it. They didn't build it right on top of the old church, and that's why we can do this archaeological investigation. So it is a fascinating site. And again, the benedictional of Ethelwald comes in to help us out. This is an unfinished final illustration. It was actually relatively common to not finish the last illustration of a manuscript. And here is another depiction of Ethelwald, and he is acting as a bishop inside a cathedral. You can even see the spire on the top with its little weather vane, a rooster weather vane, which also appears in some of the hagiography from this era. We know there was a rooster weather vane. And its bells, which are also described. And here I've got a close-up these are clearly monks. We can tell because they're tonsure. They have that shaved crown of their head that indicated you were a member of the monastic order. But above them, dressed differently, is a different gallery of what I like to assume are laypersons, who are very clearly differentiated from the monastic audience that Ethelwald is preaching to. And so this is a contemporary illustration of how people imagine what was going on inside the Old Minster at Winchester. Well, what sorts of things are going on in there besides pilgrims and miracles? I mean, that's a sort of irregular event to have happen. We are fortunate in that we also have a programmatic document for the Reform movement called the Regularis Concordia, and that's where my image at the beginning came from, a frontispiece to one of the copies of this Regularis Concordia. What is the Regularis Concordia, other than a mouthful? It's an expansion of the famous monastic rule of Saint Benedict, which was the rule of life that monks observed, how they were supposed to live out their everyday lives. Why did it need an expansion? Because Ethelwald and his fellow reformers wanted to cram it full of more liturgical celebrations, largely. But in the beginning of the Regularis Concordia, the reformers have included some explanations of what they want to do. And while the other reformers of the time had a hand in composing the text, and indeed Dunstan is mentioned in the introduction, the Archbishop of Canterbury and fellow reformer, modern scholarship is confident in ascribing most of this text to Ethelwald himself. And it best seems to fit his own monastic context at the community of the Cathedral of Old Minster in Winchester. It's also worth mentioning here very briefly that the Rule of St. Benedict, which is a much older document, does not actually demand strict claustration for monks, and indeed includes numerous rules for how monks are to behave when they leave the monastery and go out and interact with lay Christians. So this idea of strictly cloistering the monks is something that is developing more and more over time. It doesn't really go back to the Rule of Benedict itself. Now, it's relatively easy to imagine that some of the other English reformers, like Dunstan, were less keen on some of these changes that Ethelwald was putting in. Most of the Regularis Concordia, therefore, is focused on the key priorities of the reformers, and they don't have much to do with the laity. For instance, there's a lot in there about protecting the monks, but even more about protecting their wealth. Their lands, making sure no one can take lands away from monasteries, and detailing this expansive set of liturgical ceremonies on both a weekly and an annual basis. But those annual ceremonies give us a key detail into the mind of what Ethelwald is thinking about here, about his outreach to the laity, even here in this extremely monastic and explicitly monastic document. So on Sundays and feast days, the bells of the church, like those ones we just saw illustrated, called to the Mass the plebis fidelis, literally the plebeian faithful. And that's a term which implies a less august audience than the monks themselves. Those of you who've taken some Roman history here may be familiar with the term plebeian or pleb. That is the common man. That hardly seems to imply the monks, who are, of course, the ultimate Christians in this world's mindset. But even more tellingly, the Regularis Concordia expressly demands that for Easter, extra communion bread must be prepared and saved, not only for the brethren of monks, but for all of the faithful. And while that does indicate that the laity likely only observed, rather than participated in Mass at other times during the year, at this key ceremonial time in the Christian calendar, monks were expected to provide the most critical component of pastoral care to the laity. And it's worth remembering that annual rather than weekly Mass was relatively common for the majority of lay people throughout much of the medieval period. You might go to church once a week, but you would only participate in the Mass probably once a year for most of the Middle Ages. So this is showing the monks providing that key element of pastoral care. But just after this, we find perhaps the most interesting section of the whole Regularis Concordia, a special ceremony for Easter called the Quem Quaeratus, or Visitatio Sepulchri. There we go. Again, another illustration from the Benedictional Ethelwald. Now, this is introduced with a very tentative clause that says, "Now, since on that day we solemnize the burial of the body of our Savior, if anyone should care or think fit to follow in a becoming manner certain religious men in a practice worthy to be imitated for the strengthening of the faith of unlearned persons and neophytes, we have decreed this only." I say tentative because that goes, maybe if you want to include it, you could. It's really good. You should try it, but you don't have to if you don't want to. But who is it for? It's for the ordinary laity, to the uninstructed and the novices. Now, it's relatively easy to imagine that some other English reformers were less than keen on this ceremony. In part because, as far as we can tell, this is the very first known instance in Christian history of a dramatic reenactment of the most crucial of New Testament stories. The three women come to the tomb and find it empty. Right? In later centuries of the Middle Ages, this simple ceremony would be expanded into the famous mystery plays that ultimately helped to cause the rebirth of theater in Europe after centuries of not having really any theatrical history whatsoever after the end of the ancient world. But in the moment, Ethelwald provides a very telling reason. Why should we put on this little skit where we reimagine this crucial moment at Easter? He says it's to provide for the strengthening of the unlearned, as well as for young monks. And that's a phrasing that expressly includes the laity and their need for Christian education alongside the monks at the same time. In fact, it's the monks putting on the skit for lay people, quite explicitly. But one final example, and it comes from an unusually informative, but also unusually frustrating document produced by Ethelwald himself, and that was a conclusion that he provided in the vernacular version to a translation of the Rule of St. Benedict that the bishop made himself at the behest of the king, King Edgar. And modern scholars usually refer to this as a separate document from the translation of the Rule of Benedict called King Edgar's Establishment of the Monasteries, because that's mostly what it's about. For just a moment, though, let's pause to just think about the magnitude of the main document here. Ethelwald has translated from Latin, a language which only the most educated people know in this time period, the central text of monasticism, the Rule of St. Benedict. And he has translated it into Old English, which vastly more people can understand in this time period. So the very fact that he's doing this shows a sort of outreach to the common lay Christian about a central element of monasticism. Now, some scholars have put forward, well, maybe he's doing this because, some people took monasticism as a retirement option. They wouldn't become a monk until just before they died, and they might not have time to learn Latin. But the very fact that he's producing it for a non-monk, for the king, to me, suggests that the audience is much larger than this relatively narrow group. And indeed, the preface, the follow-on, the conclusion that we call King Edgar's Establishment of the Monasteries is very telling in this respect. It's actually a brief summary of a more famous work of early English history by a monk by the name of Bede, who wrote in the 700s, and that's a text known as the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Now, Bede had died some 2 centuries before Ethelwald had even founded his first abbey. And the ecclesiastical history that Bede described was about the founding of the English church in the first mission that converted the English from paganism to Christianity in a mission sent by the Pope Gregory the Great in 597. And basically the century of history between this great mission sent by Gregory until Bede's own day. So Ethelwald is basically summarizing this massive work of history in about 3 pages. And it's often been thought of as a golden age, this era that Bede was writing about, and that is certainly the way that Ethelwald presents it in his very brief abridgment. Now, it's worth pointing out that Bede's text is, of course, much longer and very complicated, and modern historians have pored over literally every single word of Bede. It's one of the most important works of history from the Middle Ages. And modern scholars have looked very technically at the Latin. They've shown that it actually shows us a very diverse early Christian church, although they do admit that Bede, himself a monk, tended to focus on monasticism. He's actually very careful to point out when someone is or isn't a monk. That distinction is entirely lost on Ethelwald. He's not reading it the way a modern historian would, and we can prove that by looking at his abridgment, this very short abridgment. What he chooses to retain of Bede and what he adds are very telling. He erases all of the complexity that modern historians have found in Bede, and instead even adds in a few lines that aren't in Bede. And when you're cutting so much, adding something in really tells you something about it. He adds a line found nowhere in Bede, for instance. He puts a word into Pope Gregory the Great's mouth that his missionaries, quote, should eagerly found monasteries to the praise and honor of Christ, which gives a much more explicitly monastic take on Gregory's mission than the actual words of Gregory the Great that had been very diligently recorded by Bede. Ethelwald, for instance, cuts down a long list of advice provided by Gregory to the missionaries that Bede had copied in full, and he retains only the following, quote, "You should teach and establish for the servants of God the same mode of life which the apostles maintained with their society in the beginning of our Christianity. They all had one heart and one soul, and no one of them had any private possessions, nor even said that he had any, but all things were common unto them." In other words, according to Ethelwald, they lived like monks, not holding any personal possessions. Now, in the original version, Bede goes on to describe how Gregory said, okay, yeah, but you have some clerics and they can't remain continent, which means they can't remain celibate, so you can let some of your clergy marry. Ethelwald cuts that. We don't need that detail. In fact, that detail cuts away at his understanding of what was going on. Moreover, Ethelwald added another phrase not found in Gregory and Bede that I just mentioned. They all had one heart and one soul. In other words, he's emphasizing everyone in the mission was the same. In other words, they were all monks. No other form of clerical life was permitted. Ethelwald then ends his summary of Bede by saying that this same mode of life, therefore, through the admonition of the holy man, was for a long time progressing and prospering well in the monasteries of the English nation. But, and I hate that but is the bane of my existence, because 3 or 4 pages have then been lost from the manuscript. And it picks up in the middle of a sentence 3 centuries later about the life of King Edgar, Ethelwald's pupil and patron, and all about his sponsoring of monastic reform. So we have no idea what Ethelwald thought screwed everything up from this golden age of monasticism. Did he think it was the obvious choice, the predations of the Vikings that had happened in between? Did he think, as some modern historians have pointed out, that it was the fault of English kings who realized they'd given a lot of land away to the monasteries and decided they wanted it back? Or was it some other unguessed at reason? We will never know, because this particular version of the translation of the Old English Rule of St. Benedict that contains the conclusion written by Ethelwald survives only in that one manuscript, and that one manuscript is damaged. It's absolutely fascinating. I got to spend some time with it at the British Library. It's very, like I said, it's very badly worn. But some later scribe has actually gone in and made little additions to it in the margins and in between the passages. And I could only see this really well under ultraviolet light. I had to ask the scholar, this is the coolest thing ever. I mean, it's the biggest nerd day of my entire life. I had to go up to the archivist like, can you let me use the ultraviolet light? And they said, yes, but you absolutely cannot take pictures. He only gave me 10 minutes with the ultraviolet light. It can damage the manuscript. But I actually found out from looking at this, the scribe who's noting it in here comes from about a century and a half later. He's writing sometime in the 1100s. And he actually noted that the pages were already missing. Because you can see on the next page, the scribe actually writes in, what is going on? Like, what happened here? So these pages were lost relatively early on, which is probably why we don't have a second surviving version of it. Very annoying for me. But what we can tell from it is that for Ethelwald, the age described by Bede was a model of how the English church was intended to operate. And that church was entirely monastic. Again, modern scholars have long cautioned that we should read Bede's original work of history very carefully, and that it does not, in fact, describe such a homogeneous, all-monastic institutional church. But it does not seem that Ethelwald read Bede's work in this careful way. He was not a modern historian. For him, the original English church had been monastic, and it was monks who had originally converted the English to Christianity, and thus must have provided for all of the laity's pastoral needs. Now, as with many questions that we have about the past, especially the pre-modern past, we will never have a clear and obvious answer as to how Ethelwald felt about monks as providers of pastoral care to the laity. And because that was not what he was concerned with addressing in the documents he and his circle wrote about, which survive, and which we are lucky to have at all, as much as I may cry in my sleep over this missing 1 to 3 pages. We must build up arguments, like good historians, from many angles and across many genres of evidence, architectural, literary, historical, and then, even then, all we can do is say, this is a compelling possible explanation, but there are others. That's the work of history, not simply to find something so unambiguous as the facts, and usually when you can prove something happened, it's not something particularly interesting, but to instead provide the best interpretation that we can and keep searching for new perspectives that will help us see the past through a new lens. Thank you.